All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome tonight to Local History Guild. As folks come into the Zoom room, I will just say hello and welcome. My name is Marina Dawn Wells. I'm Assistant Curator of History and Culture here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on this beautiful uh, June night for Local History Guilds at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. This is our quarterly Zoom program, an informal discussion about art, history, science, and culture related to the museum's mission, the collection, and the surrounding local region. So, in this edition of the program, we will be very gratefully joined by esteemed scholars. Our speakers tonight are Anne Verplanck, is Professor Emerita at Penn State, Harrisburg, and Emily Voelker, who is Assistant Professor of Art History at UNC Greensboro. And we will all three discuss together the history of photography, the very early history of photography, 19th century, and portrait photography in particular. I am your host, Marina Wells, and I'll start us off by discussing our current exhibition at the Whaling Museum, which is entitled Look Pleasant, Please, Early Portrait Photography in New Bedford. And I have so much to thank both of our speakers for. Their impact on this current exhibition. Both of them were involved in early conversations during the sort of research and curatorial phase of this project. Um, and I will ask all of our attendees, please hold your questions till the end, and I hope we can engage in conversation before we wrap up in about an hour. So I hope this will also encourage you to visit in person if you're able. This exhibition that this program relates to tonight is on view until September 7th. So pay us a visit this summer, bring your summer visitors here in New Bedford. So I will get us started with a brief look at our material from the exhibition, a little bit about how it came about. Of course, today, in this day and age, we are rather accustomed to taking photography for granted and portrait photography in general in this era of the front-facing camera on our cell phones, right? The ubiquitous selfie and our point and shoot technologies. But in the months and years after photography's invention in 1839, photography is a very big deal. I've been working on and in the collection of the Whaling Museum for the past 3 or 4 years now. And the museum, it has approximately 1 million items in general, and about 200,000 of those items are some kind of photograph. These include most types of 19th century photography. This is sort of a very brief, rather reductive timeline that you can see. But this is just from the period that the exhibition covers, about 1839 to 1900. But our collection covers all types of photographs up to the present. Um, and in this early moment of photography's creation on the world stage in 1839, what is happening in New Bedford? Of course, there is this very particular historical moment wherein New Bedford has whaling at its height and all these industries that made New Bedford the wealthiest city in the US precisely at this moment of photography's emergence. So this city is very prosperous precisely at the same time as the invention, the expansion of this technology in the 1840s and 50s. And the wealth here is an important sort of accompaniment um, produced by the lighting and the lubrication industries created with whale oil. This generates a consumer class that has expendable wealth for photographs, to have portraits captured. And just like today, those are of oneself, one's loved ones. There's just a really interesting relationship between the world's biggest whaling port in the 1800s and its many photographic studios. In the whaling era, often people are away from shore, from their loved ones for long periods of time. And whaling vessels, they can go away for months, but more often years at a time at this point. And these early mobile forms of portraiture, um, daguerreotypes or daguerreotypes, these cased photographs, also ambrotypes that quickly follow, um, they preserve one's memory and are described as mirrors with a memory, or their sort of focus and attention, their ability to capture a person or a moment. And this is important to think about in our moment historically, where in the 19th century you did not have endless sort of digital albums to scroll through as we do today. So I always think about, in this context, the pictures on my fridge, the picture that I have on my phone background, and how these images are meant to last or maybe not. And so I often, in dwelling upon this, just as a total aside, feel encouraged to print out some photographs or consider how they are going to be passed down, because of course this is part of the change that photography brings about. So there are all kinds of different photographs that, as technologies quickly succeed one another, follow one another. This is one of the cases in the exhibition that shows different types of daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, and so on. The most important thing in my mind, and I'd be curious if my fellow speakers think of this the same way, that there's an important distinction between these early pieces are handheld. And the first earliest photographs are often protected in cases, and later photographs, and this is another case in the um, exhibition, they are mounted on this sort of card backing as reproducible paper photographs created with negatives. So, in other words, the earliest pieces are sort of fragile, they're one of a kind, they're highly valuable, enclosed, gem like, while the latter part, around 1860s or so onwards, end up being a little more expendable. They resemble business cards or physical cards that are traded, they're sent in the mail, they're more easily included in albums, and so on. It's Throughout, though, they are social forms. And then, of course, at the very end of the 19th century, this concludes the sort of periodization of this project. You have glass negatives, but then you have flexible roll film in cartridges. You have handheld cameras, technologies that make snapshot photos very popular. And that formal seated photograph becomes less essential, less central to the history of photography. Whereas, um, you can see this kind of image by Portuguese photographer Manuel Goulart on Martha's Vineyard. It's capturing movement. It's a mobile technology around the turn of the 19th century into the 20th. And of course, this leads us to the sort of 35 millimeter cameras that we're more familiar with more recently today, that become common in the 20th century, are handheld cameras. So between 1839 and 1900, photography was incredibly popular. And we see this in New Bedford, where there are over 200 photographers in this 6 decade period alone. And these businesses, they're really embedded in the community and they reflect the community. Throughout the 19th century, waves of immigration made this region rich in various vibrant cultures. So, for example, in New Bedford, whaling ushered in a significant Portuguese population, initially from frequent contact with the Azores, and photographers in New Bedford seem to have spoken not only English and Portuguese, but French, Spanish, Swedish, and probably other languages that we don't know. So, for people of all backgrounds, the photo studio was a space where different relationships played out, where photographers and sitters represented personal identities together. So, I'll just glance ever so briefly at some of the material that will be represented in the exhibition. So, photography does first arrive a couple years after it is first invented in Europe in New Bedford. In 1841, uh, Messrs. O'Brien and Faxon arrive at the scene, um, numbered 7 Sheepside. They practice upon the system of Professor Morse of New York, reads this article or advertisement in the New Bedford Mercury on July 9th, referring to Samuel Morse, who's one of the first daguerreotypists in the US. And it was also noticed that the itinerant O'Brien and Faxon take a limited number of pupils. This probably included possibly Philander Bryant, who is the first photographer who was previously a worker at a dye house, in a jewelry business, and a farmer, but he would become the first semi-permanent photographer in New Bedford, as listed as a daguerreotype artist, according to the municipal directory. It's impossible to know how many people took advantage of these sort of lessons of early itinerant photographers, but we know that a lot of people took advantage of the services themselves, and photography sustained significant interest over the coming years as it grew and the businesses grew and populated the commercial downtown in increasing numbers. I am personally interested, of course, in the physical qualities, especially of these very early photographs. Part of my research here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum in the collection has been handling these early pieces, especially the daguerreotypes and ambrotypes, are fragile. And you can see that they're protected often with a sort of paper backing on the interior of these cases. Soon after the creation of these very popular portrait forms, there are standardized cases that get created and are easily able to encase and close them uh, to be placed together in the photo studio. It's made simple as a process for studios to produce a lot of portraits of the same size and to use these same materials that fit together. And in general, there's very little reason to take these apart unless you are a sort of nosy researcher like myself. But behind the picture, there sometimes is information. So you see these advertisements, either for the case manufacturer or the photographer. So this can be useful information for research on the background of these. Uh, for example, you have this image of Lizzie Marble. This is a whaling captain's family with her child, Freddie. And this is fairly standard, this advertisement, but occasionally there are some special gems behind them. This is Charles W. Morgan and an ambrotype portrait that we have of him, another whaling merchant and owner in that we have in the collection here. And Morgan's ambrotype portrait was originally a gift from one family member to another, and it holds within it this note, a flattened leaf. Uh, the note says, "For Sue, with her cousin Emily's love and wishes for a happy new year, January 1st, 1860." And this was likely for Sue or Susan Waln Morgan from Emily Waln Morgan, the daughter of Charles. So neither the subject nor the giver uh, nor the recipient could have known that Charles would pass away just a little over a year later in April 1861. And Emily would then follow him also in June. So this is one instant where that mirror with a memory really has significance. And you'll see more in the exhibition, this sort of anticipatory material for mourning that photography was in this special case. And with all of these connections to whaling in the case of New Bedford in particular, there are several examples where sailors are explicitly a noted audience for photographers. One of the first daguerreotypists advertised in the local newspaper that they were catering to seamen who are about to depart on long voyages, in the words of their advertisement. So, just as seafarers gifted things like scrimshaw or locks of hair, you can think of this sort of traditional idea of a um, locket or the idea of a sailor's valentine. They also offer portraits to preserve their memory, seafarers of different kinds in this community. So, for example, Edward Sidney Dunshee is a photographer who comes to New Bedford. He's a traveling or kind of itinerant photographer in the 1850s, and the whaling industry is at its height at that point, and his advertisements show that although he comes from Vermont, from a very different type of community, he was aware of his seafaring audience. So in the New Bedford directory, he posts an advertisement for his amber types that reads, they are a durable picture for carrying to sea and will not change even underwater. They're secured in such a manner as to be excluded from air, therefore will last ages. So you can imagine that this is a uh, very particularly speaking to a seafaring audience. The majority of studios that emerge over the course of the 19th century in New Bedford were walking distance from the water. And you can look closer at photographs in our collection, various types, as you see here, some of them reproductions of earlier images. Our understanding is enhanced by studying those directories where you see many of the advertisements and addresses listed, as well as census records and street photographs. A lot of women come up in census records, especially in the 1870s, as working in photographic studios, although they are rarely named the actual owners. And these records and images indicate where and when photo studios filled these buildings in the commercial downtown as it grew and changed, and also who runs them, the diversity of photographers who are filling these roles as photographers and cultivating those spaces, especially as New Bedford changes in the later 19th century. So it's really difficult to overstate the importance of these businesses on the cultural landscape. These businesses do compete, and photographers train one another, they exchange information. Sometimes they sell materials to one another that we can trace through seeing different negatives printed by different photographers. And they also sell their cameras and occupy different spaces. So, for example, Dunshee, that photographer I just mentioned, employed George F. Parlow, who is the origin of the quote, look pleasant, please. That's allegedly what he said to the patrons, to the subjects in his studio as they sat in front of his camera. And it's possible to see Parlow's space and his display outside of his studio walk up that then changed hands to the photographer James E. Reed, who in the exhibition you'll see much of his materials. We have a large collection of his studio contents. So you can see that in these street photographs that we have glass negatives of the same site, the same studio display and sort of advertising display outside of their spaces about 10 years apart or so on Purchase Street. So the combination of researching the material photographs in the connection in the collection combined with these municipal directories, the census records, these street photographs, it gives us a stronger sense of um, the commercial downtown photography's role in the community as it changes in this post-Civil War period. And there's much, much more to research. I invite folks to come visit and do their own research, see the exhibition themselves. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the collection. So I so appreciate Anne and Emily being here to broaden and deepen the conversation that this exhibition intends to start. So I will stop there and ask Anne to go on ahead and continue uh, the conversation there. Thank you.
Um, there we go. So, well, thank you so much for having us this evening and sharing so much about what you have found out in your work on New Bedford. Um, I'd like to chat about Quakers in early photography. And my research is focused on Philadelphia, and I'm hoping there are some interesting parallels between the two places that we can all think about. And by the mid 1800s, one could have a portrait done in a variety of media, virtually anywhere in the United States. These included, as you see on the screen, oil paintings, watercolor miniatures on ivory, silhouettes, photographic images, and drawings on paper. And as those of us who've had the good fortune to be in New Bedford today have seen, there's lots of this in the collection here as well. So as Marina mentioned, in 1839, cities like New Bedford and Philadelphia became major centers for creating daguerreotypes. And daguerreotypists also traveled from town to town in places such as Western Massachusetts. People were just captivated by the novelty of daguerreotypes, the possibility of taking their portraits, having their portraits taken quickly at a modest cost, and the seeming accuracy of the images. Quakers were particularly attracted to daguerreotypes as they had been to silhouettes earlier, in part because they perceived these forms as involving less interpretation by an artist. And I should add that Quakers largely avoided oil paintings and watercolor miniatures on ivory. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Quakers' choices around what they chose to have their portraits taken in. I am interested in Quaker life generally, and I hope we can think of parallels in places indeed other than Philadelphia and New Bedford. Because we know that New Bedford had a very vibrant Quaker community as well, and as Marina has shown us, a very vibrant photographic community. Okay, there we go. Daguerreotypes are silvered singular images on copper supports in cases, and were popular through the 1850s. And some firms, as we've heard, did ambrotypes later on, and they had less reflective surfaces. Most of what you could see, what most of the images you'll see tonight could fit in the palm of one's hand, as Juliana Woods do here, and could only be viewed by one or two people at a time. They could also be stood up on a table, but we have lots of evidence of them being held and looked at. So why Quakers? They could make a lot of choices about their possessions and behavior that both fit with older ideas about what Quakers should and shouldn't do, and also their interactions with non-Quakers. And so their portraits are a way to look at that through a different lens. Their decisions about possessions and behavior were based on largely unwritten guidelines, about plainness, and their selections varied over time and space, different media, the branch or the sect that they were a part of, their relative devoutness, as well as their wealth and age. So the Quaker standards seem to have been conveyed through general practice and through individuals' written and very likely spoken remarks, rather than noted in meetings or disciplinary records. A key choice some Quakers made was about clothing, which very much outwardly separated them from non-Quakers. The limited color palettes and specific garment cuts of Quakers' clothing was slightly plainer in color and cut than non-Quakers, was often very distinctive. And this is often captured in daguerreotypes and in other images, such as the print on the left. And I show you a period costume from Chester County outside of Philadelphia. So Quakers' daguerreotypes had some very specific characteristics. They were generally smaller, they had minimal tinting, often less elaborate poses, and bore less embellishment on the inside and the outside of cases. And as I mentioned, often depicted people in plainer costumes. And I should also add that the differences between Quakers and non-Quakers daguerreotypes are quite subtle, but I hope noticeable. So daguerreotype studios varied greatly in price and reputation. The brochure for James Maclise's establishment was one of the more prominent studios in Philadelphia. The prices range from 1855, or in 1855, and they varied in size and the amount of coloring. Prices ranged from $1 to, as they said in their ad, $10 and upward, according to the size and style and finish. Other Philadelphia establishments produced daguerreotypes for as little as 25 cents, but a few dollars was pretty much the norm. At the same time, by comparison, painter Thomas Sully charged from $80 to $200 for an oil portrait, and John Henry Brown, who did portrait miniatures, received $100 to $200 for his works. So these were much less expensive. Daguerreotype firms actively competed with one another for business using newspaper and directory ads that noted their prices, quality, fixtures, and ambiance. And here I show from 1846 a newspaper that had ads for 4 different daguerreotypists all in a row, and you can see how they are comparing themselves. We're charging $1.50 when others charge $3, and so on. So having talked about daguerreotypes broadly, I'd like to convey in the images that follow that, at least in the Philadelphia area, there are some characteristics among sitters that are worth thinking about. Oh, what's this? There we go. So many early Quaker daguerreotype customers were involved in the city's very vibrant scientific community. Wealthy Quakers had daguerreotypes taken, and this is interesting because in a lot of places, daguerreotypes largely appealed to the middling classes. And the Quakers who had them taken were both ones who were well integrated into the non-Quaker community through business and benevolent activities, as well as those who remained more separate. Typically, Quakers, as I mentioned at the very beginning, had little or no interest in paintings or miniatures, but preferred silhouettes and then later daguerreotypes. And Quakers, regardless of whether they were Hicksite or Orthodox, embraced daguerreotypes. And without digressing into the specifics of Quaker history, I'd like to note that there were significant schisms within the Quaker faith in the mid-1800s that often divided families and communities, and where they were over issues about who's interacting more with people outside the Quaker community, who is there's sometimes wealth distinctions among different branches, as well as the degree of evangelicalism they were choosing to practice. Now, I should add that clothing was also important. But the one that I'd really like to emphasize is that when one factor about daguerreotype images is emphasized, like larger size, another is often diminished. For example, less coloring. And again, this gets into the subtlety and sometimes even uh, one might think that I or anybody else is making too subtle distinctions among images, but I leave that to you. So Quakers primarily went to the area's most prominent daguerreotype establishments, regardless of whether they were Quaker-owned establishments, by generally patronizing the better ones, such as Roots shown here. Quakers ensured that they would have a greater chance of obtaining a high-quality image and were more likely to interact with their socioeconomic peers of all faiths. So with that background, let's look at several family groups and see the range of choices they made, as well as note some differences between Quakers and non-Quakers in their daguerreotypes. So an extended family of Hicksite Quakers helps us see the similar choices made by Orthodox and Hicksite Quakers. And in Philadelphia, this was the big break in the 1820s that happened. The McIlvaine Bassett family, who were Hicksites, were associated with the Darby, Pennsylvania monthly meeting just west of Philadelphia. They show Susan Bassett on the left is in a relatively elaborate case taken at the Collins Gallery in 1852. She's shown in a more ornate gallery setting and is housed in a more embellished case than that was the norm for Quakers. But really overall, it's relatively simple compared to what the options were. It's Though she's using things like this gallery setting with all these props, it's a small image. The planar example on the right is far more typical of the members of the McIlvaine and Bassett families. Again, you see a woman wearing very traditional Quaker garb. She doesn't have any props in the background and so on. Members of the Orthodox Haynes Bacon Wister family were in the forefront of scientific thinking and practices in the city, and that included an early interest in daguerreotypy. So despite their worldly and wealthy and Orthodox position, they chose modest-sized cases and levels of embellishment for their images. So most family members wear clothing from the more somber end of the spectrum rather than specifically Quaker garb. And here, Hannah Haynes Bacon wears a dark dress with limited ruching and a small lace collar. And among Quaker sitters, dark colors, plain or subtly patterned fabrics like this. And for the women, little or no lace on the cuffs and at the neck are the norm. And the other thing to add is if there's tinting, it's done sparingly. Older and more devout women tend to be portrayed in the most distinctively Quaker clothing and sometimes quite sort of old-fashioned clothing. And I should add that that older women of many faiths often wore relatively old-fashioned clothing. The Wood family's daguerreotypes provide the opportunity to look at a worldly and wealthy Quaker family. They had strong ties to the non-Quaker and Quaker elite communities. And Richard Wood's, shown here, broad, lucrative business interests included banking as well as iron and coal investments. So he was really forward-looking in what he did. And he was intrigued by daguerreotypy at an early date, noting that in 1840, he had an image done by one of the earliest photographers, which is not this image, but an earlier one. And over 20 years, the family had at least 24 daguerreotypes done. So the Wood family ones are slightly less austere, whether it's in how they're composed or the attire than the ones you've seen so far. And when this is a slightly more elaborate one of Carolina, Mary and Juliana Wood, they're in a somewhat elaborate setting, but again, fairly plain clothes. And this is a full plate daguerreotype, one of the really large ones that are like this compared to most being like this. So the absence of embellishment is also on the outside of the case, is sort of also an interesting thing. So unusually large, but on the plain side. And I bring you back to Juliana Randolph's small daguerreotype, 1/6 of a plate, and she's in a gallery setting, arms resting on a table, relatively elaborate case, though it's a quite inexpensive case. But she's got this pink coloring on her cheeks, which we relatively rarely see that kind of coloring with Quakers. So when one attribute is accented, others aren't as emphasized, I would argue. And as we sort of wrap up with comparisons between Quakers and non-Quakers, we've got the Canaro family here. And they were well-to-do Episcopalians, and their fortune was tied to steel, though the patriarch of the family was an artist. So Charlotte Canaro and her daughter wear dark dresses, but elements of their costume are a little bit more elaborate. You can see the dress is dark color and has only a small lace collar. She's got these very elaborate lace gloves that are not found among Philadelphia area sitters that are Quaker. And she's got this very the woman on the left has the pleated bodice, and again, a more elaborate detailing than with most of the Quakers sitters we see. And, for example, Julia Randolph on the right. So these comparisons, I hope, help us think about how and why many Quakers had their daguerreotypes done. The perceived lack of an artist's hand in the creation was part of the appeal, but many Quakers also opted for modest-sized cases with limited embellishment and had little added in the way of tinted cheeks or gilded brooches when they went to these galleries. And as I said all along, the differences between Quaker and non-Quaker daguerreotypes are often very subtle, and one is left to wonder whether Quakers' restraint also had an impact on some non-Quakers' choices to embrace the more subtle end of the spectrum of choices. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing any questions later on.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne, for your talk. I'm going to share my PowerPoint now, and I'm Emily Voelker. Okay, so I hope you all can hear me all right. And I am going to be sharing today work from my current book project. And this is interesting, I think, to consider in relationship to the first two talks, which have focused a lot on local daguerreotype and photographic practices and along the sort of east coast of the United States. And what you're going to see in the material I work on is how these global practices and histories are interconnected with very broad international networks. And so the title of my book currently is Generations: Photography, Archives, and Sovereignty Across the Indigenous Atlantic. And when I use this term indigenous, I am referring to Native American sitters in photography that were both made and circulated internationally during the early reservation period. And I'm a professor at UNC Greensboro, so I just want to start out by acknowledging I work on the historical homelands of the Kiowa and Sora, and also with members of the 8 tribes of North Carolina, one of which just recently became the 575th federally recognized tribe, and that's the Lumbee. And so, what I think about in my work is how Native people have long been actors across the Atlantic world. And when we use this term, the Atlantic world, we are talking about this interconnected transoceanic space between the Americas, right? So we see the coast here, the eastern seaboard of what becomes the independent United States, down into the Caribbean, South America, across from which we have, of course, Africa, right? North and kind of west central coast of Africa, and above Europe. And so from the earliest contact between Europe and the Americas, indigenous people were central actors that moved across this transatlantic space. And what I think about is, how does photography come into the mix when it's born in these histories of art making between native nations in what becomes, in my work, the United States I focus on, and right, these long histories of contact. So, of course, we can think about in the 18th century, a map of which we see on the left, we have these multiple colonial players across the Americas, Spain arriving early, then, of course, France that settles New France, and the New England colonies, right, Britain. And when these colonizers come, they enter into this entire world of indigenous belief systems, relationships, languages, and that's represented by the map on the right. And of course, we have the shift to an independent United States and the expanding landmass of the United States. So my work looks at how photography enters into these long histories of colonization of North America, and specifically what becomes the independent United States, and how Native peoples become central subjects in early photography with the especially move to the reservation era. So, just to kind of contextualize this, when I say that Native or Indigenous peoples of the Americas are central actors across the Atlantic world, one really good example is Tyondenega, or Joseph Brant, who is a Mohawk leader and actually fights for the British in the Revolutionary War. The Mohawk, being the sort of most eastern of the Iroquois Confederacy, are incredibly powerful players in the time period leading up to and during the Revolutionary War. So he will fight with the British, and he will make multiple trips to London during his life. And this is a portrait that he gets painted by a leading British portraitist of the day, George Romney. And it's been argued art historically, right, how he shows markers of both his sort of European identity as well as indigenous identity, which we see with the gustoa, the feathered headgear, as well as the gorget he wears around his neck. So By the time we get to the independent United States following the Revolutionary War, we know, right, that these painting traditions will continue within the sort of purview of the Department of War, Department of the Interior, and then will be supplanted by photography. So photography becomes widely dispersible in paper formats by the 1850s. And this is what Marina brings up, these glass plate negatives. Well, this makes photography very sharp, crisp, and widely reproducible. Daguerreotypes are unique, they are not reproducible. So by the time we get to the 1850s, paper photography is taking off. The second half of the 19th century is also the major global colonial period, the second major global colonial period. And this is when the expansion of the United States is happening. So, as Native nations have delegates going to Washington, D.C. to negotiate treaties, many of which are not entirely or ultimately observed and relate to land secession and loss, photographs are made. And this is to show you an example of an Oglala Lakota delegation portrait of these leaders in Washington, D.C. My book looks specifically at Plains nations, and the most prominent that I look at is the Lakota. And the Lakota are the longest holdouts to the reservation system, right? So the reservation is not in place for them firmly and kind of reservation mode of living until the late 1870s. So this is an incredibly fraught period in which this photograph is made. And a lot of the negotiations are happening through translators who you see often these Euro-American men seated at the front would be, the agent for the tribal community, maybe living on a newly established reservation, and translators. So at this time period when this picture is made, what has happened is that, we see this large, these large black borders here, and the yellow and the blue within. Well, this is the Great Sioux Reservation of 1868, established with the Fort Laramie Treaty. But what ends up happening is that in the region of this reservation, the Black Hills, which is a sacred place for Lakota people, gold is discovered by Lieutenant General George Armstrong Custer in 1874. And so there is a kind of flood of prospectors to go after this gold. And this is what ultimately leads to the Battle of Greasy Grass or Little Bighorn in 1876. And when General George Armstrong Custer is defeated, and this ultimately leads to the passing of the Black Hills Act, in which much of this reservation territory is lost, right, to the Native people. And I show you the contemporary reservation lands on the right here today. So these photographs are being made during this period of intense dispossession and sovereignty struggle for Native nations in the United States. And the other thing I just want to show you is not only are they being made, the archives are now in our national institutions at the Smithsonian, they are being disseminated by the Smithsonian and kind of survey leaders and parties mapping the West quite internationally. So this is to show you a set of these delegation portraits that is printed and put together specifically to be sent to London in this time period. So we can think about how they relate to a very local sovereignty struggle, but they're being dispersed internationally. So this sort of context of diplomacy is one major thread of the photographs in my book. The other major type of photograph I look at are photographs made in contexts of performance. And what I mean by this is, when we get to the period of the reservation system for Plains and specifically Lakota people, the late 1870s, it is a radically new way of living for people that were historically nomadic. And one of the ways in which communities adapt and survive, Lakota communities, is they become performers in Wild West shows that take off by the 1880s. So Buffalo Bill's Wild West is the first of these shows. It's established in 1883. William F. Cody, who's the sort of impresario of this show, had fought in these plains wars, these conflicts across the plains as the United States landmass is spreading. And then he develops this show in the 1880s. And so Lakotas will be recruited and paid to perform in these shows. This is an example from my book. It's from a group of 148 photographs that are in albums now and were made in Paris when Buffalo Bill's Wild West was there for the 1889 Expo Universelle, or World's Fair. This is the World's Fair for which the Eiffel Tower was built. They were there for 6 months. They lived in an encampment and they performed. And we see there's references to performance in this photograph because he holds a fan that says souvenir of the Eiffel Tower, right? A paper fan that could be bought from going up the Eiffel Tower. So thinking about the sort of contrast and the ironies of going abroad to perform this indigenous identity while the reservation system is being completed in the United States. So the final element of my book that I want to just share with you before closing is that along with these archival works related to diplomacy in photography and performance in photography during the reservation period, my work also has a collaborative modality with communities. And this is to show you a digital humanities project that I worked on at Pine Ridge, which is one of the Lakota reservations in South Dakota and one of the largest reservations in the United States. And this whole project was about linking material like these photographs to oral histories at Pine Ridge of descendants of performers. And so thinking about what do these photographs mean in a community context and how are they related to sovereignty? And you probably, coming back to this term, which is in my title, well, what does Native American or Indigenous sovereignty mean? It refers to the right of Native Americans and Alaska Natives to govern themselves. And this refers to the ability to create tribal governments, to have a court system, enact legislation, and have law enforcement. And so, one other thing just to note, though, is that in the kind of discussions around sovereignty, a major aspect to sovereignty is also visual and cultural, right? So, how Native people are represented and the control of heritage and belongings by Native American communities. And so I just want to end by showing you this work by one of the knowledge keepers that has informed my book. His name is Arthur Amiot. He is Oglala Lakota. He was born on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The work is called Generations, and the first part of my title really respectfully borrows from this because it is a way of thinking about these photographs in intergenerational context for the Native nations, source communities that are represented within them. He makes these beautiful collages in which we do see references to Wild West shows, as in the middle here, these Lakotas across the landscapes of France with the cathedral behind here. And he makes reproductions of these photographs and then he collages them into his own storytelling. So, this is a way we would think about visual sovereignty, this reclaiming of this photographic material in these archives, and using historical photographs like those of his great grandfather, Mato Najin, who traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West and was at the Battle of Greasy Grass or Little Bighorn, as well as those of Wild West performers that he has in his collection and that he works with, cares for, and stewards. So I'll end there so we have some minutes to have questions and conversation, but this is to just show you another major kind of use of photography in relationship to the local and the global and issues of identity in the United States.
Thank you so much for these astounding talks, both Anne and Emily. Thank you so much. Um, Absolutely fantastic. I wonder if anybody in the audience has questions for our next couple of minutes as we wrap up here. I'll keep an eye on the chat, but also I invite Anne or Emily to engage any questions that have come up for you as well. Anything off the bat? I'm happy to.
I think one thing that struck me seeing Anne's talk and some of the discussion in your presentation, Marina, is this idea of what photography offers that other media do not. And so like why it's fascinating that Quakers are really interested in photography and how this relates to their thought and belief systems. But also like there's writing about the choice to switch from painting to photography in picturing Native delegates in Washington, D.C. in the 1860s and like why that choice was made. So the kind of belief that is, going into what a photograph is and can do in this time, in these decades of the 19th century, and like how it's being used for that reason, for certain purposes and by certain communities.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking very briefly to the sort of very present, at least in our cultural imagination, but certainly in that moment, the culture of sailing and being away for a long period of time in this big whaling community in New Bedford. Of course, there's an importance in the mobile quality of a small cased photograph that transports a person's likeness that then allows somebody who's away from them for years at a time and maybe the person passes away in the meantime or something. That kind of thing seems very valuable uh, in the case of New Bedford. And it's something that, yeah, I think is under research. I certainly still want to continue pursuing that as something of interest because it's not a complete or exhaustive archive at this point, but that's something that comes to mind. But Anne, I want to hear more about the Quakers too.
Emily, that was such an interesting observation, and I'm intrigued by Marina's comments. What also comes to mind is the evidence for all of this is the surviving images. We don't see this in writing, and it keeps, it sort of, to me, it just really emphasized the importance of um, looking at visual evidence, looking at it in quantity often, and the importance of collections like New Bedford's, where you can really study what was saved. And again, it's always saving and collecting practices are quite uneven, but the kind of repositories that all three of us have had the privilege of working at are so central to the kind of conclusions we can draw, just as Emily has done.
Yeah, and as Emily is also uh, saying in her work, the institutions are complicit in both the presence and some of the absences or the sort of political biases that are um, living in our continued,
Mhm.
yeah, collecting processes and the ongoing lives of these archives. I think I am considering, just as we wrap up here as a sort of final question to chew on, something I was thinking about last summer when I I was sort of working with Emily and thinking about photography in the context of the American Antiquarian Society at that point and thinking about exhibitions of historic photography. So 19th century photography, do exhibitions or projects of any kind, book projects, say, or presentations about photography, do we always have to address the materiality of 19th century photography? Always, it seems to me, there emerges a moment where we have to address the weirdness of the type of photographs that we're looking at. What is a daguerreotype? It's copper and silver and all the sort of material realities of it. Is it because it's clunky? Is it because it's strange to us in our different experiences in the 21st century? Do you agree or disagree that there always has to be commentary on this? And it's something that I continue to grapple with, but is, I would admit, a little bit marginalized in the case of the current exhibition. It's something that is sort of literally swept to the side. It's on a wall for sure. It's present, but it's not central. And so I wonder what your sort of hot takes would be about that, either of you in your sort of respective uh, areas. Yeah.
Well, I guess I would throw out that whether it's an exhibit, an article, or a book, one can have five or six themes, but something's got to dominate. And you make reference to materials in the exhibition, but or you could have done a whole exhibition that focused on materials and
Right.
where the silver is coming for the silver images, and that we all make choices in what to emphasize because the readers and visitors can't just be can't receive all the information, and it has to be information that our specific audiences bring their own thoughts and ideas to. So this combination of what's right at the moment, what the collection brings, what you as a curator or writer bring, and the audience's knowledge and expectations.
Yeah, I would just say I think it's really hard to talk about the dissemination and life of images in their historical context without talking about materiality and in a lot of senses technology. What like the fact that a daguerreotype is unique rather than reproducible really dictates how it lives in the 1840s. And the
Yeah.
fact that by the 1850s, we have reproducible photography in paper formats from glass plate negatives is why it begins to be used for imaging people and populations and then disseminating that really widely to tell more public stories. So I think whether or not you focus on it, your interpretation, like in a museum show, if you're talking about the life of those images, it's sort of embedded, your knowledge of that is embedded in that because it dictates so much. And I'll just say, in ending, as someone who teaches, my students, when they take history of photography with me now, many of them do not know what a negative is. So, like this question of, well, what is a daguerreotype? Do we always have to talk about the materials? That this whole world existed in which light and chemistry was making the images is
Hmm.
very, very different, I think, for especially young people who might not have ever taken analog photography or interacted with them that much.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is a fantastic point. Thank you so much for that. And I hate to cut off our conversation. There's so much other rich material to cover. So thank you so much to both Anne and Emily. Thank you so much for spending your Tuesday night with us in the Zoom room. Thank you, everybody who has attended. And I encourage you to come see the show and to keep exploring your own relationships with photography. And I not only come and visit the exhibition, but visit the New Bedford Whaling Museum. I'm actually leading a cyanotype workshop a month from today on the 9th of July. So I welcome everybody to register for that. You can find that on the Whaling Museum website. So keep thinking about photography. And thank you so much, everybody, for spending your evening with us tonight. We'll wrap up there. Take care and enjoy this beautiful summer night. Thank you both again so much.
Thank you.
Right. Take care, everybody. Good night.